of our current members in attendance. So I will call the meeting to order at 3:35 p.m. We have now can open it up for public comment for items on the agenda, which we've only got one item today, which is discussion and input on the fiscal year Measure Q&E fund draft proposed budget. So I will open this up to public comment now. Do we have any folks here in the room that want to make comment? Okay. And do we have anybody online who would like to provide comment?
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have no raised hands.
AGP, do we have anyone online on the phone to make a comment?
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have no raised hands in the queue.
Okay, so it looks like no public comment at this point. Next up is the agenda item, so discussion and input on the draft budget. Sarah, did you want to provide an overview?
Yes, thank you very much. Let me pull up my slides. Good afternoon, Chair and committee members. So I'll give a brief overview of what was in the CFAC staff report, and then we have 4 of our department heads here for the departments that are requesting fiscal year 22-23 budget from the Measure Q&E fund, and they'll be available to answer any questions or go into more detail as the committee might request. So first I'm going to just provide a bit of background about the Measure Q&E budget. The Morro Bay Municipal Code requires that CFAC review Q&E expenditures, and council requests that you provide input as well on budget and spending priorities each year. That input will be provided to City Council at the May 24th and 25th budget study session, and they will take that into consideration in their final decision making on the budget. So the proposed budget is currently in draft form, and I'll mention as I go through, there's a couple things that may change before final budget adoption. So just wanted to remind the committee and the public that it is in draft proposed form. This is kind of some budgeting and accounting framework, but just as a reminder, the city does account for all revenues from the Measure Q&E measures, which are now remitted to us as one measure from the state of California in a separate fund, a separate governmental fund, which is Fund 3 on our books. We also budget all of the operating costs in Measure Q&E that are associated with Measure Q&E expenditures. And then for capital projects, we budget those in a separate fund, which is one of our capital funds. So we do make interfund transfers from the Measure Q&E fund into the capital fund, which is the 915 fund on our books for capital projects. And then consistent with council direction, we do carry forward unexpended CIP budget, assuming that the project is going to continue moving forward. And then one more piece of background. These are the 4 council priorities for the expenditure of Measure Q&E funds, and these were established last year during the budget cycle after the passage of Measure E. There was a long and robust effort, which I understand CFAC was a big part of, and council as well, in looking at the ballot language for both measures and coming up with these 4 priorities that encapsulate both measures and the priorities for spending. So the intent is that all of the proposed budget measures before you tonight comply with one of these 4 priorities. So as a reminder, those are to maintain public safety. I'm not going to read all of the words on the screen for you, but maintain public safety through a variety of measures, maintain and enhance cleanliness and safety of public spaces. And then on the next slide, we've got investing in infrastructure and equipment and ensuring the financial health of the city. So we'll jump right into the draft proposed budget for 22-23. The revenues this year for the first time are expected to be $4.3 million. That's a significant increase from just 2 years ago, when clearly there was just Measure Q on the books, and that was about $1 million revenue source a year. So there's been significant sales tax growth in addition to the passage of the additional 1% tax. And so this number is actually up roughly 9% from 21-22. We do work with HDL, our sales tax consultant, to generate these estimates, and they're not anticipating such significant growth in out years. So this 9% increase is really continued recovery from the pandemic, and we're not expecting to see that same level of growth in the years beyond. The total expenditure budget is $5.2 million, and I'll go through that in detail in a moment. And so the delta there is use of fund balance that is both from, I think it's a partial fund balance from fiscal year 1920 and a partial fund balance from 2021 that's available for expenditure. So we are cognizant of the balance between ongoing expenditures and one-time expenditures. And so the fund balance portion plus a part of the ongoing revenues are really recommended to go for one-time CIPs. And then I did want to mention that we are amidst labor negotiations, so we're doing that at the same time as our budget development this year for all of the city's 3 bargaining units. And so we do anticipate some personnel cost increases, and so we've left, you'll see, a bit of fund balance to be available to accommodate that. Let's see, I already described the revenue increase by 9%. So moving on to the expenditure side. Of the $5.2 million expenditures this year, about 46% represents ongoing costs, and that is across 4 departments. So primarily police and fire, and to a lesser degree public works and the harbor department, and we'll go through those in a moment. And then the other $2.8 million, or 54%, are one-time costs, and those are all this year in the form of CIP costs and also one loan payoff cost that we'll go through. So this just breaks down visually the distribution by department, and you'll see this large non-departmental share accounts for the capital improvement projects and the potential fire station loan payoff contribution from the Q&E fund. So first for the police department, the staffing component is 1 sergeant, 2 police officers, and 1 community service officer. The community service officer is the only portion of this staffing that has changed in fiscal year 22-23. There's some information in the staff report about why that position is being recommended, and we can certainly go into that if you have questions. And then the police department supplies and services are also fairly similar to last year's budget. We make several contributions to the county and public agencies for the SWAT team, the county bomb, drug, and gang task force, et cetera, out of the Q&E fund. And then the records management system is a one-time project that started in fiscal year 21-22. It's not going to be fully completed in 21-22, so there will be carry forward budget available, and we will need to spend the remainder of that in 22-23. But it's the same project. It's not a $100,000 increase next year. It's just carrying forward. The police body camera annual support, I think that has also previously been budgeted in Q&E. That's $29,000. And then in the fire department, we have the same 3 full-time positions budgeted here as have been budgeted here before. And we are adding some part-time budget here for the firefighter reserve program for a total of about $0.8 million for the fire department. There are no supplies and services budget requests from the fire department for Q&E this year. We've been fortunate to be able to purchase some supplies and expenses through ARPA, the federal funding that we've gotten from COVID relief for the fire department. So that's been really a helpful one-time infusion of funds. And so this year, we're also not budgeting debt service payments for the fire station, contingent upon direction from CFAC and council to move forward with the 2016 direction to go ahead and pay off the fire station loan remaining balance. There's a remaining balance of approximately $1.2 million on that loan, and the interest rate is 3.75%. So the Measure Q&E fund is currently paying debt service for that, and we ended up saving about $500,000 in interest for the life of the loan by putting in about $260,000 now. Again, that is 2016 direction, so staff's recommendation is consistent with that direction, but that could certainly be revisited if desired. And I'll mention while I'm on that the general fund would pay for the bulk of that loan payoff because there was a one-time property sale proceed that was received during fiscal year 21-22 and previous incremental payments that were accrued to the general fund. So the general fund would pay for everything that the general fund has received life to date from that property sale, and the Q&E fund would just make up the difference, which is about $250,000 or $260,000. Moving on to Public Works, the Q&E fund request is to fund 1 maintenance superintendent, 2 maintenance worker 1s, and 1 0.8 associate engineer, as well as part-time consolidated maintenance budget. So some changes here are adding a maintenance superintendent position. This is not a new position for the city, but this is a reinstated position, which is recommended after operational assessments, and Mr. Quella can speak to that further if you'd like. And then the associate engineer is a reconstitution of funding that was in the budget last year for CIP project implementation. We went out for a recruitment for a senior civil engineer. We're unsuccessful and have created an associate engineer position that was added at mid-year. So this is consistent with council's direction at mid-year. The other 0.2 of that FTE would be funded by the water and sewer funds because that position would also support some of those capital projects. And then we would continue the prior year practice of budgeting $26,000 for sidewalk and curb repair in Measure Q&E. Moving on to Harbor. The change here this year is adding the Harbor Reserves Program to the Measure Q&E fund. The Measure Q&E fund currently and previously has funded the Harbor Lifeguard Program in 21-22. And given the other constraints that exist in the Harbor Fund, the request is that Measure Q&E Fund also fund the Harbor Reserves Program, which does contribute to public safety in the city. And then on the supplies and expenses side, there really aren't any significant changes other than the increasing cost of trash disposal, but that is a cost that has been budgeted in Q&E before. And then finally, the capital projects. So the pavement management project is a new project scope and a new project request for 22-23. I think there's a correction that we need to make on the project timeline in the CIP budget on page, I apologize, I don't have the page number, but in your packet on that CIP application, there was reference to carry forward budget from the 21-22 project. We'll be treating those as 2 separate projects with 2 separate scopes of work and funding allocations so that we can very clearly communicate to CFAC and the public how each of those project scopes was spent. So the intent is to carry forward the 21-22 budget, but that's not part of the 1.38 that you see here. This would be an additional 1.38 million so that we can catch up with our pavement management program, which has been delayed. The second project is a contribution which is consistent with prior council direction to make contributions to the intersection at 141 so that we remain eligible for SLOCOG funding. So Measure Q&E did contribute $600,000 last year, and the proposed budget has $600,000 contribution again for this year so that we can gradually get up to the amount that SLOCOG needs to see as available so that they will continue to earmark our SLOCOG allocation. Moving on, we have an automated license plate reader camera system that's been requested by the police department. And there was a question about this. I know the intent of this is not to catch speeding cars or to focus or to function as a red light camera or anything. It's to track license plates that are under investigation for criminal activity when they come in or out of the city. And the chief can speak more specifically to that. And then we need to complete a citywide speed survey. It's been some time since the existing one has been completed, and so that needs to be updated. That would be $75,000. Next, there is a $90,000 request to complete ADA accessibility upgrades at Quintana and Maine. And I believe that's the one that has grant funding associated as well. So that would supplement that. And then finally, the Harbor Department has requested $210,000 for design work for the replacement of the boat launch. And then construction would need to be funded in out years. So that's a total of $2.5 million in one-time capital expenditures, which I think we're excited that the city has the opportunity to invest that amount in capital, that Q&E helps make that possible. So we're interested to hear CFAC's feedback on that. And then I already went into the loan payoff a bit. I forgot I had a slide on it, my apologies. So just a quick recap. These are the same numbers I covered before. $1.2 million loan payoff amount. This is a USDA loan, and it was the Coral Avenue property that we received proceeds from in 21-22. And the general fund would pay the other million of that $1.2 million. We think that $260,000 number might actually end up being a little less, but we wanted to make sure that we had enough when we actually got the final USDA loan payoff quote. So that number may actually go down by the time we get to the adopted budget, slightly. And then finally, we have our fund balance projections and our fund balance history. And so you can see here that there really was a significant fund balance that built up at the end of fiscal year 2021. And we're projecting still a significant fund balance at the end of fiscal year 21-22. So a portion of the prior year fund balance was allocated for CIP projects in the current fiscal year budget. And those funds, as I mentioned, are primarily for the pavement management plan. Those will be carried forward because that project will be bid out in the months to come. And then we would use the remainder of the fund balance for the other one-time capital investments next year, leaving an approximate fund balance of just under $100,000. And as I mentioned, some of that we need to leave available for pending labor negotiations. And with that, we are, of course, seeking CFAC's input or feedback on the proposed Measure Q&E uses for council consideration. And so the recommendation before you is to receive this draft proposed budget and provide input for council consideration as needed. And it would be helpful if, after your deliberations, that could come in the form of a motion that we could pass on to council. Thank you.
I imagine some of the members will have questions on certain sections, so I would propose we just go back to each of the sections you reviewed and see if anybody's got any questions. We'll address it one by one instead of jumping all around, if that works. Does that work? Great. Does that work? Okay.
Would you like me to start with revenues?
Sure. I've got one question on revenues. So the projections that you're getting for this year's budget, I know there's some lag in these revenues where it takes a while before it shows up. What is their methodology for developing the estimates for your actual revenues?
Yeah, a good question. They actually look at every individual business in the city of Morro Bay, and they have, I don't know how many, but many years of historical data that they're looking at. They look at industry trends. They do forecasting for the state of California sales taxes. They provide this service for, I think it's hundreds now of California cities. So they use all of that market data that they have, as well as Morro Bay's local data, and come up with a forecast. And so they, in our case now, forecast specifically for our general fund sales tax revenues, and then separately for the Measure E revenues.
And so it's an accrual basis. They're forecasting what you would actually earn versus the cash that you would actually receive this year. Is that correct?
We accrue, so we will receive the revenues at least 2 months late and accrue them back to the fiscal year. And yes, the projections reflect that.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from committee members on revenues?
Madam Chair, I think one of the things that we discussed last year was the ability to kind of look forward. I think in several portions of the presentation, Sarah, you said kind of the out years, kind of going forward. I guess I'll reiterate my comment from last year that it's not possible to put on blinders that we are in every decision probably committing for a long time personnel costs. And there's probably 50 to 60% of the Q&E funds that are already committed based on prior year's actions. We're not going to unhire a police officer. We're not going to decide whether to keep a firefighter from year to year to year. And so it'd be very helpful for us to understand the revenue projections and based on kind of a realistic projection. I know there's been some hesitation to sort of share that 10-year forecast and to look at it historically, but I think you're asking us to make decisions that of committing money for the interchange improvements, for capital, and in terms of my own decision making, I'd like to know how much uncommitted money is available over the duration of that 10-year period, and how much flexibility do we really have for those one-time expenditures. So that's a request that I guess I'll repeat from last year.
Certainly, that's a very valid point. I can't speak to prior finance directors. Now that this is a major fund for the city, for major governmental fund for the first time this year in our ACFR, I think it would be appropriate for us to do, this year we did a 5-year forecast for the general fund, and to be able to do a 5-year forecast at least for the Measure Q&E fund. I can give you a sense of, off of my memory, the sales tax revenue projection in the general fund in the fiscal year 23-24 was in the 3 to 3.5% range, and they were projecting that it would stabilize after that. So not in the 9% range, but certainly we'll make a note that you'd like to see the forecast.
That's fine. And I know in prior years it's been kind of half of the HDL projection to be conservative, but I think we need to sort of look at what's the real history. We've got a pretty robust history, and as we're asked to make decisions on how much staffing we put into this that will probably not come out, it's helpful to see the growth of that, how much of that growth will be consumed by probable increase in cost for labor, so we have some understanding of the delta that's really discretionary.
Certainly, and I just want to clarify, this projection is not half of the HDL projection for fiscal year 23. It's pretty close to the full projection.
Thank you.
Okay, moving down the list, as we get into the expenditures sections, do we have any questions from committee members on the police expenditures? Okay. Any questions on the fire expenditures? No questions. Okay. Public Works?
Yeah, really quick on the Public Works side of this. What's that? Okay. Real quick on the Public Works side of this. I've been asked by a few people to go back to the water treatment plant that we're doing right now. And the Quintana Road is pretty much in disarray right now. And what I'd like to know is repairing of Quintana Road and all the other roads that are being torn up right now for that, is that included in the budget for that treatment plant project? So in other words, when I drive on Quintana Road right now, and it's just an absolute mess to drive on, tell me when it's done, I'm gonna have a real road to drive on that's gonna be smooth.
Mic up. Greg, here. That's a really good question. Thanks. That's a really good question. First of all, I drive on that road twice a day too, so I feel your pain. The contractor, Anvil, is required to fix all of the areas that were disturbed as a result of the conveyance project. So they can do that. Now, the reality of that is going to be, it's not going to be a brand-new road. And so the city, internally, staff is looking at, what is it going to take to actually repave that road completely. And, initial estimates are pretty high, maybe around 2 to 2.5 million. And we don't think, or we're not certain that would be an appropriate use of sewer or water funds. Because again, Anvil would be recovering those parts of the roads that were affected by the project. But I know that, our residents expect kind of a smooth experience down that. It's a major arterial for us. So we would be looking at, in out years, repairing that road. I can't guarantee that that's going to happen at project completion. It's certainly not something that we're currently budgeting for this upcoming fiscal year, because we also still don't know timelines. We still have to put an IPR line down Quintana Road that hasn't been done yet. So there are still a lot of unknowns about timelines, so we decided not to put it in this upcoming fiscal year.
Okay. Yeah, because obviously my concern with a lot of people's concern is these are fine proposals and projects, and I support them. I think they're great, but it's making sure that I would hate to do some of these projects in here and knowing that there's a glaring problem out there in the coming year or two with Quintana Road amongst many other roads out there.
That's very good input.
Yeah. That was it.
I hate to do it to you, Greg, but is your mic working yet?
It is.
Great.
I think it is. Is it? Yeah.
Was there a reason that you excluded storm drains from this year's capital project budget?
It's not excluded from the capital project budget. We just don't have it in the Q&E budget. So we did make requests for the Juniper Elena storm drain project, as well as the Sequoia storm drain project. We also have carryover funds. Now this might be too loud. We also have carryover money that we haven't yet spent for the Juniper Elena project. So those emergency storm drain repairs are still on our radar. They just weren't requested for Q&E funding.
There were budgeted funds for storm drains in this current fiscal year. Has that work been done?
Some of the design work has been done. We haven't started construction on any of that work yet.
When do you anticipate doing that?
Oh, I'd want to speak with the city engineer about our exact timeline, but that is one of our 3 top priorities.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm confused regarding the funding for the pavement management plan.
Yeah.
In this fiscal year, QE budgeted $1.150 million for the street projects.
Yes.
And according to the timeline on page 17 of our staff report, in the projection section, it says carryover from 21-22. Does that mean that there are the new net funds for 22-23 for street maintenance is only $463,000?
It does not. So the short answer to this is we made a mistake in how we input this information into this budget document. Originally, we were treating it as this is our annual account number for pavement management. And so we were carrying over funds and then adding more funds. That's why some of the project timelines got mixed up, because for us, it's really just one annual project. And whatever money we don't use, it's still in the project account. We add more money, we use that for the next project. then we decided to actually look at it as two completely different projects. And so we have to, and I think Sarah mentioned it in her presentation, we actually have to correct that. So we do intend to spend that 1.15 million in the current year's budget, in the current fiscal year's budget. That project is almost fully designed. It was designed enough so that we could take it out to bid, but given that enough time has lapsed, there have been some changes in conditions. We're now updating the design, and we're also adding some ADA improvements that weren't there before, as a result of some phone calls I got from the disabled community here. And so that is a completely separate project from what we're requesting that's in front of you.
You probably aren't aware, and probably nobody is aware, but there was a resolution passed by the city council maybe 10, 12 years ago about doing street maintenance work during the summer. Whether that's, still valid or not, I have no idea. The other question I had is that between the 150,000 million, 150, and next year's expenditures of $1.3 million, whatever it is, are you going to just seal streets, or do you actually plan to dig some up and rebuild them?
Yeah, so the project that's been designed for the current fiscal year that we hope to take out to bid in a month or two and then get into construction over the summer would be largely a dig-out project along our arterials. So, for example, Main Street from the State Park to about the 41 has several dig-out areas. And really, that would be to prepare for a future seal as part of a future project. So we are going to do some very real repairs. We also have similar repairs in that project for Pacific, I believe for Anchor, and one more street that I can't think of, and Harbor as well.
Just a suggestion. In previous years, the Public Works Department used to publish a list of the streets that were going to be done, for the next year or two, and it was just included in the budget. It was I think the public found that very interesting. You may want to consider doing that.
I appreciate that, thank you.
Regarding the SR1 and SR41
Yes.
project, who provided the $150,000 grant?
That was a state grant that went through SLOCOG. I could dig it up if you give me a second.
That's okay. It's
Yeah.
state grant. I mean, has the money been received?
Yeah, well, it's received after we spend it on a reimbursement basis, so.
And also on that chart, there's another grant for $1,230,000. Where's that going to come from?
That's the expected SLOCOG money.
That's also SLOCOG?
Yeah, that's in the out years. Yeah.
Then the other is city funds?
City funds, we also have other grant funds that were part of, that were authorized in previous years in the budget. So I think maybe what you're looking for is something like a full cost accounting and budget accounting for this project, which is
Well, no,
something we could do.
It's just when you see the word other and $1,230,000, you sort of wonder whether, who other is.
Right.
Just a suggestion, you may want to footnote that before it gets to the city council.
Okay.
Regarding the speed survey, in the description, it states that it's to assist police. Having this expense paid for by the police versus Public Works with an offsetting amount in Public Works may be more in line with the major QE guidelines.
Okay, that's an interesting thought.
Just something to think about.
I would defer to our Assistant City Manager Admin Services Director, but the way we define capital projects is that if it's any major expenditure over $50,000 that has a lasting impact, it qualifies as a capital project, and it is something that the Public Works Department would perform. It's the same pot of money, whether it be us or the police. So,
No, I understand that. It's just the optics.
okay.
The ADA improvements on Quintana and Main, What, if the second grant doesn't show up, is the project still going to go forward?
We think so. It may not go forward in the coming fiscal year, but we may have to wait until we get full funding for it. But we expect to be able to fully fund that in fiscal year '23. That would be CDBG funds, which is, as you know, is a block grant, and that's more of like a allocation rather than, we're competing with cities all over the state or something. So we have a very high likelihood of getting that. We had notified the county last fiscal year that we wanted to use CDBG funds for this project, and they were very supportive of that. And so our plan, again, is to put that application forward and then use that as a match with our Q&E funds to complete the project.
Terrific. Thank you very much. That's all the questions I had.
No problem. Thank you.
Okay, we kind of jumped ahead to the capital piece there. Any questions on the harbor department? Expenditures, okay. So within the capital expenditures, I also had a couple of questions. One is, for example, the 41 interchange, there's the cost in FY23 that's included in our packet at the $600,000 that's proposed, but there's significant costs out in 2025. And it's a little odd when you see it, on the same line item as the Q&E budget, right? Because there wouldn't be enough funds from Q&E to be able to support that in future years. So where would that funding come from?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, and I think it kind of begs some context for understanding. We have a commitment from SLOCOG for around $5.6 million if we go with the roundabout alternative on this project. But in order to retain that commitment from SLOCOG, they asked the city to make a funding commitment whereby we had to come up with, I believe, $1.8 million over 3 years. Or maybe it was 2.4 over 4 years. I'd have to double check that. But so we did that. We took that to City Council in October or November of this current fiscal year. And the idea was that we would make these sort of $600,000 authorized savings, if you will. We're basically putting it aside to hold that money so that we have enough money once construction starts for the project, which is a couple years out still. So we're right now in environmental phase. There still is some decisions to be made about that project, whether it would be an intersection with a signal or whether it would become a roundabout. That's going to be a public decision. Once environmental is done, then we have design. So really what we're doing with that $600,000 is not spending it this year, just putting it to the side so that we have it when we need it for construction a couple of years from now, which is consistent with with the funding agreement that City Council approved a few months ago.
And I'll just add that SLOCOG is working through the bipartisan infrastructure law to seek additional funding for that project and other priority projects for the region. It's on the top 10 list, the Highway 141. It's been in discussion since 2000. So it's been 20 years of discussion. The concern being that you have cars stack up on the highway, coming down Highway 1 where you have a blind curve, could pose a significant safety hazard. And we've seen it happening in high school drop-offs and some of the busier days in the summer. So that's why it was flagged by SLOCOG as a priority. Of course, the value of that project's probably gone up a bit since it was estimated a couple years ago at $8.5 million. So we're definitely tracking that, and thankfully there's a lot of funding available at the federal level for projects like this. So we anticipate working very closely with SLOCOG to fulfill the remainder of the project. And they needed a good faith commitment from the city of that $600,000 a year. And that was a decision made by council.
And do you feel that that's in line with the language in the Q&E measures, that basically putting money aside for future uses?
Yeah, that was where they made the decision to do that. Certainly could take it from the general fund, but it's either one or the other. But having that secured is what SLOCOG was looking for, that commitment. Otherwise, those funds would be relinquished to other projects in the county.
Okay.
I did have a question or comment on that one line item as well, as you remember from last year. I was supportive of the original $600,000 funding to make the project as shovel-ready as possible, hopefully getting some leverage. I think as we're learning today that that has kind of grown into a commitment by Q&E to fund the city balance of it. And it sort of goes to my comment earlier tonight or this afternoon that it would have been helpful to know that our action last year also would result in a $1.8 or $2.4 million commitment by this fund for the project. So I just want to make sure we're making decisions with our eyes as open as possible, because this money vanishes pretty quickly, and it's putting $2.5 million or $2.4 million aside for a match on a project that could be handled with a pretty sophisticated signal system is a lot of money for a town this size. So I would expect that if you're going to bid in 3 or 4 years, if you're looking at $8 million today, you're looking at $12 million then. And is it really something that far out that can be funded with SLOCOG's contribution and the contribution that this community is able to make? So
Yeah, it's a fair point. If the city were to go in a different direction, signalization, it's interestingly enough not that much more cheaper than the roundabout. There's still a substantial outlay the city would have to assume, and there would be $0 coming from SLOCOG to fund that, because they don't see it as supporting the ultimate goal, which is to reduce that safety hazard. So the city would bear that cost entirely on its own. But your point is valid, and I think Sarah and I looking at this sort of without a formal 5-year, we're trying to retain funds in Measure Q and E along the lines you were speaking about, Mr. Peck. Understanding there's escalation in those labor costs over time, that we still maintain, between general fund and Measure Q and E, $1.5 to $2 million in capital each year, because that was one of the goals of Measure Q and E with the voters. So council made a choice in investing that in Highway 141.
All right, I had a question on the license plate readers. Are those vehicle mounted or stationary?
Yes, thank you. Those are stationary units.
So they'd be installed at certain key intersections?
Well, actually, they would be installed at the entrance and exit points of the city. Based on the unique layout of Morro Bay, the geographic design, it would be better equipped to put them at the entrance and exits of the city, so we would be able to capture the vehicle license plates of everything that either comes in or leaves the city.
Okay, thank you. All right. Any other questions on the remaining items in the capital projects? The speed survey?
Madam Chair, I did have a question on the boat launch facility.
Sure.
Requested funding. I am supportive of spending planning and design money so that we can be shovel-ready, grant-ready, so that can be funded in some way. I think we've missed out on some opportunities recently because that didn't happen. This one, for me, probably doesn't rise to the same level of urgency on safety. And so I wanted to understand from the director what the balance of the funding would be. Is the additional funding the actual construction? Is that something you're expecting to do with funding other than Q&E?
Thanks for the question. So the funding we're requesting is, for preliminary design, planning, and permitting, and we would be applying through the Department of Boating and Waterways, which has been a traditional source for that sort of funding for the remainder. DBW is usually a year or two out, depending on where you fall in their cycle. So that would be our first intent, to seek the remaining funding for the construction.
And to answer the question, the second part, the Measure Q&E wouldn't have sufficient funds to address that and other harbor needs. So really, it's to the point you just brought up, Mr. Peck, is that we hadn't been able to apply for other funds in the past successfully because we didn't have more fully formed plans and starting permitting work. And that, it's an unfortunate part of the game is you have to spend those funds to get the funds, right? But in this case, we feel that this project's reached that level where we need to start planning because it could fall apart on us, and that's a major economic driver for our community.
Eric, wasn't there a similar grant several years ago regarding this that the city wasn't able to fulfill because of some extraneous requirements that weren't funded or something?
Correct. We applied for and received a $1.9 million grant from DBW. When we applied for the grant, they preferred that they did the concept, design, and cost estimating, and then they gave that to us to insert into the grant application, and we agreed with that, and we did that. Turns out their concept design and cost estimating was woefully inadequate. It didn't account for all the things that we knew it was going to need to be done in terms of, environmental compliance, drainage, parking lot repaving, other sorts of things like that. And when we tried to revise the scope of the grant over a period of about 2 years, every time we tried to pull things off the list of items to take care of in the grant to really take care of the core things, which were the ramp and some ADA accessibility and a couple other things. But every time we pulled an element off, they would pull the equivalent dollar amount off the grant. So the grant amount kept going down, and we couldn't solve it with DBW, so we ended up having to give the grant back. This is going the other way around and getting the engineering and the stuff up front and bringing it to them.
That's great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for the explanation.
Yep.
And if you're trying to draw a line between this project and the language in the measures, what would you connect it to?
I mean, I think there's a safety component. I've toured the boat launch ramp, both the concrete that people boat into and the gangway people walk out to, and it's beginning to just show wear and tear, and has a safety element to it as far as I can tell. But I'm not an expert. I'd leave that up to Eric. But the Measure QE definitely discusses maintaining safe and clean public spaces, and waterfront would be part of that.
Sorry, I got down too early, I guess. City manager's correct. It's deteriorated to the point, it was probably put in the 1980s, late 1980s, the concrete ramp itself, and the concrete seriously deteriorated, and the ramp itself is starting to get a little on the rickety side. So it is becoming a safety issue, or is a safety issue.
Okay. Any other questions from committee members on the capital expenditures? Okay, so I think that's all there is to talk about here. So Sarah, you're looking for a motion.
I just wanted to remind you to take public comment.
Okay.
So we don't have to open it
You
again?
did already in the beginning, but you can offer it again if you'd like.
Is there any additional public comment here in the room?
Okay.
Is there anyone online? I don't know if they can hear us.
There are no hands raised, so you guys should be good to go.
Okay.
We did have some agenda correspondence, didn't we?
We did have some agenda correspondence. Does anyone want to raise any of that I didn't see some of it as being relevant to our content today, but does anybody want to bring anything up to ask questions of city?
Wasn't that regarding the bathrooms on?
Yes.
When I looked at that, I thought that instead of approaching us, that citizens should have approached the Public Works Advisory Board, which I think is in their bailiwick.
I think they were also included, but yeah, I don't think there's anything for us to do as a committee on that until the city's developed a proposal around it or decided to pursue that. Okay. Do we want to, as a committee, formulate any comments to submit to city council, or would you all like to do that independently?
I have several comments.
Okay, go for it.
I guess the first comment is I'm in support of the paying off the fire station loan. I'm very pleased that there wasn't a debate about using the proceeds from the sale of the Coral and San Jacinto property to pay off this loan. I've got a question regarding the SR1 and 41 roundabout. The reason I'm asking this is because I don't know how long it takes to secure funding from one of the state agencies that provides infrastructure loans, hoping they're not all like the SRF group. My concern is that since SLOCOG's board is composed of elected officials, their priorities could change every couple years. Also, construction costs, as Scott just mentioned, could well exceed existing budget. So I would like to know if there is a backup plan that would help cover shortfall if this project goes forward. And the reason I'm bring that up is I happen to concur with Mr. Peck on that, is that I don't want to end up in a situation in 2 or 3 years where all of the money for the pavement management plan for 2 or 3 years gets dumped into this project. So I don't know, when I asked this question last year, the existing public works director sort of basically blew me off. And I don't care to know what the plan is. All I'm suggesting is that internally, you do have a plan that you could put in place quickly if it turns out you need to borrow some money. The other comment I want to make, and I stated this at the last meeting, I disagree with including public work administrative expenses in the Q&E budget. I recognize that both positions are needed. I just don't think they should be charged to the Q&E fund. When the voters agreed to tax themselves, they were never told they were going to pay for administrative expenses. The maintenance supervisor and the associate engineer should be paid for by the general fund. These expenses could be offset by public safety employees and/or additional maintenance workers in the Q&E fund. I just want to get that on the record. That's all.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any general comments? Go ahead.
Yeah, a couple things real quick. One, as far as input back to the council, in particular when it comes to infrastructure, and considering we're talking about the Q&E, and I've brought this up before, is some type of message needs to be sent to the council, at least from this member, that in the future, we need to really start exploring funding mechanisms for our underground infrastructure that nobody ever sees. Because as I think everybody knows in this room, it's deteriorating pretty bad. And unfortunately, it's one of those projects that always gets laid by the wayside. And I know Q&E can help fund some of this. But I would like to see somehow this council and the mayor start moving forward on looking forward in future years to start exploring funding mechanisms in order to start taking care of that very infrastructure that I know everybody in this room is painfully aware of. But as I said before, it just doesn't get the airplay that everybody wants. And that's really unfortunate too, because it's a real important part of any community, especially in future generations. The second thing is, I think what Homer's bringing up is extremely important and right. But I'm going to respectfully disagree that if you do go through the Q&E actual piece of legislation, barring the fact of what members of this community may or may not have understood of what they thought Q&E was for, the council has every right to say whether or not we're going to use this for staffing or not use it for staffing. But legally speaking, the city has every right to use it for staffing. Now, whether or not we want to use it for staffing, that's a policy decision from the city council. But from a legal standpoint, I think we have every legal right to do exactly what's being budgeted here. Whether or not you agree with it or not, completely irrelevant. But I really do understand his concern. That we make sure that we really, it's legally permissible, but it starts getting kind of wonky at that point. That we got to be kind of careful that we make sure that we do this in terms of the spirit of what the people of this community wanted. But as far as what we have proposed in front of here, I'm perfectly fine with it. I think it meets all the needs of this community, and I think it's in the right direction.
Next. Did you have a comment?
Sure.
Okay.
And I'll echo the comments from my colleagues. I am perfectly okay with the list as proposed by the staff based on a couple observations. Number one, I think the public works pieces are more for project delivery. I've had several meetings with the public works director where the lack of staffing there is preventing us from doing things that we want done. And so I'm okay using Q&E funds for that. There are some items that probably are more strategic than would normally fall under the Q&E definitions, and I'd put the boat ramp in that category. But I don't want to argue over $200,000 and lose $2 million. So to the extent that the Harbor Fund has issues that we all need to work on, I'm okay with that one. I would ask, and offer my comments to the staff and the city council that it's easy to start using these funds. I've been in a number of cities where these have existed for a lot longer, and it sort of becomes the fund that gets tapped when other funds are short, so we don't deal with the issues of internal sustainability for an operation. And so I know the city's working with the Harbor Department and the waterfront on that issue, but Q&E isn't going to solve that problem. But I see and hear an effort to deliver infrastructure to provide the services that were intended. So I'm generally in support of what's being provided by the city, with the proviso that I certainly, to perform my function, I need to see the long view and understand commitments that the council's made and that will continue to be made and what we have left to spend.
Thank you all. My final comments would just be that since this was a voter-approved measure, you want to be sure that the voters feel like the funds that are being provided, they see tangible results for. And some of them you may see day to day, and other things. It just worries me when you're carving out big chunks that are down payments for something that won't be visible to anybody for 5 or 6 years if it's the interchange or whatnot, that you do start to put public perception at risk of, are they really getting what they voted for when they passed this measure? So keeping the focus on, show me something and show me that you're making life better here, I think is important, and I would make sure you've got a balance of that and the funding requests here. So with that, I think...
Before we adjourn, could I ask one question of Mr. Collins, I guess? Future agenda items are not listed as a line item on our agenda, but could we still bring one up?
Can we close out this item first?
Oh, I'm sorry, I apologize.
Okay.
We would prefer if we get a motion on the current item on the agenda, and then, this is
Apologize.
a special, that's okay, this is a special meeting, but
Okay, thank you.
So that's why there's no future agenda item listed,
So I would make a motion that we have received the draft proposed budget. We have offered our comments for staff to take to City Council when they present this, and make a motion that we accept it as presented.
I'll second the motion just for the sake of discussion to possibly amend. Is it appropriate with the way the members feel to recommend the list as being, or to find it consistent with Q&E, rather than just something like a receive and comment? Just asking the question.
Does anyone know if the language has been very specific to that in the past?
typically hasn't, but you could make a motion to that effect. You would need 4 votes for it to sort of be formal, adopted, but.
I'll
yeah.
withdraw my suggestion to amend then.
Okay, so we have a motion, we have a second. Any other comment?
Will you pass on some of the concerns we,
We will share your comments and all
Well,
the
that's
comments. of the
everybody's
board. Yes,
comments.
of course, with all the board members, with the council.
okay, go
Yeah.
ahead.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay.
If we could do a roll call vote just to check that box, that would be great.
Okay.
Ms. Conrad can do that for you.
Sure.
Chair Shepler,
Aye.
Vice Chairperson Alexander,
Yes?
Member Peck,
Yes.
Member Woody.
Yes.
Motion passes 4-0.
Can I do my future agenda now?
Yeah, can I tee that up real quick? And then,
Sure, whatever.
so there is a May meeting on the schedule, so I did want the committee to discuss what we'd like to address in the May meeting. Additionally, while we are still open before we adjourn, I would like some comment from the city about some changes that were made to the advisory committee that happened on Tuesday that are actually pretty substantial in terms of this committee's oversight, our meeting schedule, and just make sure I call it to the attention of my other committee members that the meeting schedule has been changed pretty dramatically for the remainder of the year as well.
Yeah, I can speak very quickly on it because it's not an agendized item, so I don't want to violate the Brown Act. But yeah, council did make changes to the advisory board handbook and the council policies and procedures. They formed a subcommittee to take up that work several months ago. And based on input they've received from the community members, from advisory board members in the past, staff, et cetera, made some small tweaks in some areas, some larger tweaks in others, and CFAC was one of those. Based on input we've received from previous CFAC members and some current regarding the wharf project in particular, feeling like their hands are cuffed a little bit in terms of looking at just the finances, but not the technical components, which the Public Works Advisory Board does, after a lot of deliberation and thought, and also talking with council members individually, including the wharf subcommittee of Mayor Heading and Councilmember Heller, felt that PWAB was the more appropriate spot for the more mundane quarterly report reviews, because that aligned more with the ongoing technical components of the project, whereas the Citizen Finance Advisory Committee made more sense for them to retain more of the strategic financial components of the wharf project and the water and sewer funds more specifically, because we know we're getting drawdowns of WIFIA and SRF, and there may need to be future amendments to those agreements and funding mechanisms, and what to do with the residual funds at the end of the day, and looking at funding for other projects. It made more sense to retain that in the CFAC than that wharf quarterly report. In addition, there were things within CFAC's purview that a lot of ways were just sort of reviewing something right before City Council saw them, like the financial, the investment reports, which oftentimes we couldn't get to CFAC anyhow, and also the audit, which is by the Government Finance Officers Association, best practices that actually is with your City Council only. And obviously Sarah can speak to that more than I can. I'm not a finance officer, but there were certain things that felt more, I don't know what the right word is. I don't want to say mundane, but just more nuts and bolts, and then really thinking of the CFAC, how to get the most value of the amazing wealth of talent and expertise that you all have, and hopefully the fifth member, if we can get one, that you would look more at the strategic aims of the city on the financial side, whether that's funding for capital projects, like you've already helped us with looking at our pension liabilities and how to start beginning to address that unfunded liability, that we felt instead of spending time on those more mundane things, you spend time there And further, the Measure Q used to be pretty straightforward review by the CFAC. It was about $1 million every year. You had about the same 4 or 5 things were funded. That changed dramatically with the passage of Measure E. There's a lot more interplay with the general fund. A lot of the discussion we just had in the previous item made more sense for CFAC to spend a lot more time than previously on that in the first half of the year, because there are 2 deliverables based on the ordinance adopted by our community through the voting of Measure Q and E. So those 2 in tandem kind of explain the changes. It's my fault that we didn't share that staff report with this group sooner. Nobody else's, so I own that. So I definitely understand the concern about not having a lot of time, but the input has been received over the past couple of years that we're acting upon. So we can spend a little bit more time on that at the next meeting if you'd like, and also talk about how that repositions the schedule and how that interplays with the city council goals process, where they deliver the work plan for each of the advisory boards and what that means for the CFAC in particular. We can have that conversation at the next meeting, if that works for you all.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I thought that was an important place for us to start before getting into
Agreed.
the future agenda topics.
Right.
Thank you. Did you have?
A handout.
You have a handout, okay.
So do we have any other items on the agenda? Are we prepared to adjourn or? Okay. Okay.
I was hoping that maybe at our next meeting, this committee could discuss reproducing this document that I just handed out. According to our mission statement, we're supposed to be communicating financial information to the citizens. And this document was actually done by the committee. One of the committee members actually did the layout, and then the city printed it. The problem I had with it when it was done was that it was, I guess for financial reasons, it was only placed as a handout in the lobbies of the city's public buildings. And I think it would be worth redoing, since the format is already done. So it's just a question of plugging in different numbers and changing a few names on the cover. And if the city would agree to spend the money to put it into the utility bill enclosure. And if you don't want to do it, probably it's not worth going through the exercise. But my thought is that a couple members of this committee could get together, and after the city council approves the budget in June, is plug new numbers in, change the names, and get a sign off by the city staff, and then let the city go ahead and reproduce it. Anyway, I'd like to know whether that's something we might discuss at our next meeting.
That's up to the group if you want to put that on the agenda. And
Yeah.
Sarah, I don't think, Sarah was not here when this was done, obviously.
Well, that's why I took the time to make samples.
Well, thank you for printing those out. I haven't seen this in a while. I know a lot of time was spent by CFAC on this. So Sarah and I can discuss offline, but if it's up to the group if you want to have that just as a reminder. We will probably just restate what I just said about the changes to CFAC at the next meeting, and then present the budget, what we can of the budget to this group on May 17th as well. So just considering time, I don't think this would be a long discussion, but
No,
yeah.
it's just getting 2 people to agree they want to do
That's
the work.
right. Yeah. So as long as the
Yeah.
group is okay with that coming back.
Yeah, this has to be unanimous.
Yes.
Well, I think the alternative is, does the city have a different way that they would, propose to send financial information out at a high level to get folks a little more knowledgeable or engaged, and are there other formats that, you see happening in other cities?
We could present that as well. But yeah, I do want to say this was a lot of effort that was undertaken by CFAC.
The only reason I mention it is just recently, due to a project I'm working on, I had an occasion to talk to 700 or 800 Morro Bay voters, and I can pretty much tell you, unless they were a city employee, they don't have a clue at how the city's finances are structured.
Yeah, and then reading through the really big, long documents is just not something most people are going to engage in, right? So I think that's a nice suggestion. Okay, so in May, we will meet. At that time, we need to approve the minutes for February, since we are not allowed to approve those today. Yes? And we'll review what you have available for the broader citywide budget. And Sarah, you also mentioned with the 115 trust, is that going to be something for the May agenda as well, or is that too soon?
Yes, for May, it would be, I don't know why I'm getting an
Turn that
echo.
one off.
It would be a quick item to select one CFAC member to sit on the selection committee for a Section 115 trust provider. Yes. Yes. Whether it's this or, an alternative, yeah.
And are we also talking about the kind of the new expectation the council has for us, and sort of a more formal recitation of what the city manager just talked about, plus maybe some interaction about what our hopes for this new opportunity we've been given?
Yep. We could put that, I think we could put that towards the end of the agenda, because there are other meetings in the near future. We could also, if we run out of time, because you definitely want to get that budget input, most importantly, and there's a lot to cover, but I think we know, what you need. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. With that, I move to adjourn. Second? Do you need to take a vote on adjournment? No? Okay. Thank you all.